The world's writers will walk through those gates, and if you hang around, you get a chance to talk to them.
I'm interested in conversations that deal with things that matter, but real, how do we live our lives?
First of all, make climate change personal in your life. The second step is get angry and get active. And the third step, and believe it or not, I think this is the most important. We have to imagine this world that we want to hurry towards.
It's about kindness is looking at people as people and not as I voted this, I do this, whatever it is. There are some people we will never get along with, but most of us are a complex mass of different things.
My name is Rajesh Hadi. I've been participating in the Edinburgh International Book Festival for many years. The festival has been central to my development as a writer. The thrill I feel as I enter Charlotte Square has never waned. I could always count on excellent programming and stimulating discussions. There has never been a time when such meetings are more important.
Welcome everybody to the Edinburgh International Book Festival audio event. Today we are joined by the incredible Wayétu Moore, who has written a gorgeous novel called She Would Be King. Wayétu Moore is the founder of One More Book and is a graduate of Howard University, Columbia University, and the University of Southern California. She teaches at the City University of New York's John Jay College and lives in Brooklyn. And my name is Jess Brough. I am a PhD student at the University of Edinburgh and a writer. And I'm also a massive fan of this book. I read it a few months ago and boldly declared that this was going to be one of my favorite books of the year. And I think I do still stand by that. She Would Be King is Wayétu's transcendent debut that illuminates the tumultuous roots of Liberia, blending history and magical realism in a profound tale of resistance and humanity. So thank you so much for being here, Wayétu. How are you doing?
For your support and for this invitation. I'm happy to be here.
I was wondering, actually, Wayétu, if you would be up for sort of kicking things off with this event with reading a little short section from the beginning of the book, because the place that you start this novel in is really interesting to me. But we can talk about that in a second.
So I'm going to read to you from the beginning of the novel. The novel is told from the perspectives of three characters that each represent the various identities that comprise Liberia as a republic. And the heroine, her name is Gbessa, and I'm going to be reading to you from Gbessa's introduction. Gbessa heard the shrub ruffle at the opening to the lake. Alarmed, she turned, but was so far into the water that she could not see. When she reached the shore, she heard the bush move again, and she followed the sound, but found no one near it. Mia? she shouted. Mia, she shouted again, rupturing the night with her accusation. Whoever it was a coward, and she wanted them to know. Gbessa returned to the lake and sat on the shore as her breathing settled. Mia? Asked a voice, deep and incensed. She sighed, ignoring him. Safwa fumed at her charge. Calling a Poro man a coward was punishable by death. Gbessa did not care. Stand, Safwa said angrily. When she stood and faced him, and his eyes caught hers, she recognized his bravery to be true. Gbessa suddenly felt drained of all energy. His eyes were brown. That once wondered what color her eyes were, instantly conscious of everything around her. Mia? He asked again, even more angrily than the first time. Gbessa knew he could not kill her, did not care if he could. She nodded. Mia, go take your ma to go feed you? Mia, go back when your ma died to see you all right? Mia, do that? He asked. She swallowed what felt like sharp stones. Poro head, do that? And eso? He continued. Gbessa's heart sank at his words. He had done what he had promised. He was king and indeed the head of the Poro, and now the most powerful man in the village. The darkness of her curse was powerful, but not as powerful as his title, his bravery. And still, whose bravery is not provoked by darkness? Was she that far removed? He breathed as though a part of him wanted to slap her face, while the other part wanted to touch his mouth to her blackness, test it for consistency, try what he knew was more than just a spirit, whose flesh and blood stood before him more rife and sweet than they who refuted it. The two stood in the night, silent, never touching. Just before morning, Safwa turned away from Gbessa and returned to the village. Gbessa watched until he was out of sight, and then followed him until she reached the house where the old man and woman sat sleeping with their eyes wide open. When they awoke, Gbessa watched them together. Their synchronization made her hollow with loneliness. She reached inside for thoughts of the forest and animals, for remnants of the lake's icy chills, but none could come to her rescue. Outside the window, Safwa was running around the village circle with his son, with no stain of the previous night, no lake, no extended stare. I'm dead, Gbessa said to the couple, who sat monotonously during their days waiting for sick villagers to knock on their door. The old woman answered, smiling. I live in, and our spirits. Gbessa persisted and stared out of the window. The couple laughed. The old woman said, continuing to chew her tobacco. You live in now. Now you alive, she said. Every night when the medicine man and woman went to sleep, Gbessa went to the lake. Every night Safwa followed her and watched her through the bush. He had kept his childhood promise, that he would protect her, that she was no different. She trusted the sound of the waves, the illumination of night, before anything else. Fegmbe kekamabe, fegmbe kembube. Gbessa heard the voice coming from behind the bushes, and that deep certainty. She looked toward the bush, toward the siren. Fegmbe kekamabe, fegmbe kemube, Safwa sang to her. She touched her mouth as his voice came to her on the backs of those night flies, resting on her shoulders, licking her skin. We have nothing, but we have God. We have nothing, but we have each other, she sang with him, trusting him, until morning came. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that gorgeous reading, Wayétu. And I know that you've done the audiobook for this yourself, haven't you?
I did the audiobook. You know, I actually had to audition for the audiobook.
No.
I told my agent after, the audio rights sold, I said, I would love to read. And so she contacted the audio publisher and they said, sure, tell her to send in a tape. So I had to record myself and send it in and compete with the other actors and actresses, but I got the part.
Imagine if you hadn't. Oh my, but the way that you read that, I mean, I would be excited to listen to this entire book as an audiobook because
I certainly understand. I know that, not all authors have the cadences that are needed to read their own work. And so I understand from a publisher's perspective why they would say, hey, why don't you send in a tape first?
Yeah. Let's just check that this is the right way forward. And I also really like that that section because you get a really clear sense of Gbessa being on the outside of these interactions between Gbessa and Safwa, who is in many ways a love interest, of being very secretive, being very much in the shadows. And I guess I'm wondering, out of all of the three main characters that we meet in this book, why is it that we begin this story with Gbessa?
Yeah, so Gbessa, this book is very much the story of Liberia, and Liberia begins and ends, and it's still sort of navigating its way through the groups that make up this republic, and that is indigenous groups, Black, freed, liberated Black people from the United States that repatriated in the 19th century, and liberated Black people and former slaves from the Caribbean that repatriated in the 19th and early 20th century. And so that story definitely begins with these indigenous groups that occupied the land before the settlers arrived. So it was important to feature these groups and to certainly introduce the story with someone who is from one of these groups.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And sort of in that introduction that I did, just reading a little bit from the blurb of the book, it's described as being a magical realism. And one of the things that I love about this book is that it combines something that I really, really enjoy reading, which is historical fiction and fantasy. We meet these three characters who have these superhuman abilities, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the relationship between fantasy and ancestral knowledge, or connecting and staying with your ancestors, because this is a voice that kind of recurs throughout the story.
Right. I certainly think that relationship, there is a correlation between fantasy and ancestry. But I think for me, my understanding of the architecture of just story, period, whether or not that story is something that explores ancestry or something that's going on contemporarily. The way that I was introduced to stories was through what people call fantasy, right? In many ways, there are suggestions of or implications of ancestral beliefs that are in these forms of storytelling. So I would be told, if I was being told a story about sisters quarreling, there would be, and so sister one, she cursed the second one. She said, "I can't stand you anymore." And sister two said, I can't believe you said that. And so she needed to get out of the room right away. And so she flew into the other room. And then so the story would continue, focusing primarily on the quarrel and not on the magical elements. Whereas I believe in Western storytelling, and certainly in conversations around this book, the fantasy and the magical elements have been a bit of a spectacle, as opposed to just a natural way of understanding these characters and understanding the worlds that they were in. The way that the novel begins is actually, I was raised hearing these adages, and my grandmother, for instance, they would say, don't hummock cats. Like, what? Don't hummock cats. Remember, there was an old woman who beat her cat to death, and the cat's ghost jumped to the top of her roof, and the house fell down and killed her. And so when I decided that I wanted to explore African literature, I started with this particular story. And I wanted to give this old woman a name and the cat a personality. And obviously after that, then it was like, well, what's left? Then I began to think, okay, so what happens on a day like this? What if someone's born? And then it just sort of snowballed after that. But I remember speaking to my grandmother about this particular story that they would tell us, which is rather short, it's about 3 sentences or so. And I said, I'm writing a novel. It's inspired by this story, and it actually begins with this story. And she says, oh yes, Karatu. I said, what? And so she said, oh yes, this is a thing that happened. So where I go thinking that I'm negotiating this history through magical elements because of my own Western conditioning, my grandmother is exposing me as someone who has sort of departed from my own cultural beliefs of understanding the world in a very unpredictable and magical way, right? And so So I would say that to answer your question, I don't approach my stories consciously in conversation with fantasy. I think it's something that is very much just a part of how I've always understood storytelling because of my introduction.
That's so interesting. I've never heard it described in that way, and I love that conversation that you had with your mum is so essential to sort of what the book looks like in terms of reframing, I guess, your memory of that story, or how you position that story of the woman in the hat. That's just fascinating to me. There's another, in terms of, if we're thinking about themes, I suppose, in the book, one of the themes that really stands out to me is that of movement and placement. And I'm interested to hear about your thoughts on movement and migration, the positive and the negative, and everything in between. Mm-hmm. And also, I guess, from the perspective of movement, not just being about people, but about concepts and ideas. And I guess specifically here, I'm thinking about the enslaved people who had been freed and their movement to Liberia, and everything that kind of was brought with that, these ideas of class, these ideas of servitude and religion. And yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on just movement as a theme.
Yeah, the human story is a story of movement and migration. And I think even more specifically, the Black diasporic story is very much rooted in migration and movement and search for home and claim of home, because of the various ways that Black bodies have been disenfranchised over time. And so it's important, I think, in an exploration of any kind of Black identity, especially Liberia, which at the time and still is, in essence, presented itself as a place for Black bodies all over the world to make a home, and to have a home to call their own. I think that you cannot tell that story without telling the story of movement. Who left? Who returned? Why did they leave? Who's still here? Why didn't they go? Right? And as I said, I think it's a very human conversation. If you explore human history, we have migrations. We're still very much migrating now. Obviously, now it's for different reasons, whether it be in some contexts refugees, or because of social and political conflicts. But then in some ways, biological conflicts too. You should really look into the exodus out of New York City since March of this year. A lot of people have left who said that they would never leave the city, right? So then what will we say about New York's population and how it was transformed in 2050 and how everything changed in 2020, the various patterns around the world? So I think it's very much a huge story, but even more specifically, when you think of Black bodies and how those migrations in many ways were forced, it becomes even more important to delve into and explore in a thoughtful way. So I wanted. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that force, use that as such an operative word there, right? Because many of these Black people who moved to Liberia went because they were sold a dream and an idea, and many were forced to go and leave from this place that they'd only called home. And I would love to hear your thoughts on, I guess, the conflict of that repatriation or settler colonialism with the indigenous African populations, because I think you write about it so well, and people weren't. Nobody was there was no expectation or preparation for this massive change for these populations and the people who came, and then equally battling with the French, the French slavers who were still on the shores, and the British, of course. And I just think you really painted that picture so beautifully. And I'd love to hear a little bit about your thoughts on that.
Well, I hesitate calling it colonialism because so my family's very mixed. My mother is Vai. She's indigenous. It's her ethnic group that I based Gbessa off of, and Gbessa village off of. The village where I feature Gbessa in Southwest Story is where my family and I hid actually during the war in 1990. So it's something that's very personal to me, this history. But my father's people are actually, he is of settler descent. They moved to Liberia in 1871 from South Carolina after being brutalized by the KKK, hearings which were recorded by the US Congress because the violence down in the South was so much that President Grant called for both federal troops and Congress to go and record testimonies of people who were being abused and brutalized by the KKK down there. And so my understanding of Liberian history has always been very vast. And I know that unfortunately, because our history is so seldom told by Liberians themselves, it's usually presented in the binary. And that binary is settler versus indigenous. Conflict lasted hundreds and hundreds of years. And I think, unfortunately, that narrative has served to discredit and disable what was for a very long time a successful nation. There is what I wanted to cover in the book was the reality that anytime you move a group of people to another place, you're going to have silos. If you go to any major city, you're going to find a Chinatown and a little Africa, and you have people who are going to just cling to each other. I think what happened, unfortunately, is because the settlers came with technology and economic power, they then were the leaders in government. They determined what the laws would be for the boundaries that they considered home. And anyone who wanted to be a part of that boundary or wanted to consider themselves a part of that country did then become they were susceptible to the stratification that was present, right? There's also like a gross national favoritism that benefited those of the settler class. And so that's not deniable. That was definitely there. I think what bothers me is the narrative that they were, the two groups were embattled perpetually. There was never mobilization because there are actually historical accounts that prove that when it counted, when their freedom was being encroached on by the French, by the British, these groups came together and they fought together. Yeah. And I think that is what Black solidarity is. It is not a presentation or even this idea of a Black utopia. It is just saying that we will be given this space as human beings to make sense of this circumstance that we found ourselves in. And so that's how I think of that story. I hate that it's told in such a binary, which is why I was committed to exploring the nuance of the settlement and a lot of what was happening. Because initially, the land that the settlers arrived on, it wasn't even contiguous. Like it was, some of it was it was purchased. The first thing that people don't know or people don't talk about, because the narrative right now is that they went and they stole the land, and I think the part that I hate the most is that then they went and enslaved the indigenous groups, and unfortunately that's just not the case. Most of the slavery that was going on in Liberia at the time, and it hurts me to say, but it was going on between indigenous groups. And so I think that now that there seems to be more of a platform for Liberian writers to share that history, I hope that those nuances are then explored a bit further.
Absolutely. And I mean, on that note, it's one of the things that I absolutely love about this book and about the nuance and the way that you reject that binary is the inclusion of Norman Arrogan, who is a character who's come from Jamaica and from the Maroons. His mother was a Maroon, and migrates to Liberia. And that's where we have this wonderful meeting of the three main characters. And I mean, is that a narrative that you'd seen before, like having those three parts of the world coming together in that way? Or is that why you specifically chose to have this wide picture of these different populations? And, you know, on that notion of solidarity as well.
Yeah. Well, as I said, it's the story of Liberia. And in order to tell the Liberian story, you do need to cover these groups. And to be honest with you, if I wanted to be even more candid, I would have dug even deeper into the indigenous narratives, because there are 16 ethnic groups in Liberia, and only 2 of those are of the settler class. One is, of course, the American settlers, and the other is the Caribbean settlers, who mostly came from Barbados in the mid-19th century, and the last settlers came in early 1920, including my great-grandmother, Tina. She arrived in Liberia in 1908, actually, from Barbados. And so you find that, you know, with these various groups and hearing stories from all of these sides, because I was raised very closely by my maternal side, and spent a lot of time with my paternal side as well, it paints such a textured and layered picture of Liberia that no, I hadn't received, and I wouldn't have received by reading any book. And so I knew that in any literary exploration of Liberian identity, I had to find a way to spend time with all of these groups. The reason that I chose the Maroons specifically, because the settlers to Liberia, who were from the Caribbean, were not primarily from Jamaica. They were actually from Barbados, although there were some Jamaican settlers that arrived. The Jamaican settlers actually went to Sierra Leone. And so it being rooted in history is the fact that he was en route to Sierra Leone, and that's when he was dropped off in Liberia. Yes. But the reason that I chose the Maroons specifically was because I did want to feature successful groups that had successfully rebelled, because the story in many ways can seem grim and very dark, because you see the various brutalities that Black people in these 3 places are experiencing. That I did want to have, I did want to feature one of these groups that had successfully rebelled, because there were groups that were rebelling. The Maroons Rebellion, this predated the Haitian Revolution, right?
Right.
And having a group like that, where you can see, oh, these are people who not only successfully rebelled and went up the mountain, but were able to negotiate with the British government and say, okay, these are the terms. This is what you cannot do moving forward. This is what we will do moving forward. And I thought that was just a brilliant addition to what in many times became a very heavy story to write, when you think of the amount of defeat that some of these groups were experiencing.
I think that's so interesting, you know, as a writer, having to give yourself a quote unquote success story, something of joy or of victory, to kind of keep you going through writing what is quite a painful narrative and a dark narrative in many ways. And I thoroughly appreciated reading that as well. And
also a reminder to the reader, right? For me as a writer, almost like a reprieve, but then also for the reader as a reminder that no, there was, in addition to the darkness, there were occasions of light. There were occasions of triumph, like unreasonable, unprecedented triumph of Black bodies during this time. And I think that is an important as well as an essential reminder.
Yeah, Absolutely. And I know we don't have too much time left of this discussion, which I've loved so far, but I was wondering if we could end by talking a little bit about your choices for these sort of superhuman abilities that our three characters have. And to me, they felt very intentional. I mean, in terms of what you were saying about survival and the placement of these characters, and how it's not that it's fantasy, it's that this is something that allowed the life to continue. And yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, and your choices on these three different qualities.
Yes, they were absolutely, the choices were intentional. Gbessa, of course, she was given the ability of immortality because I wanted to be in conversation with this idea that these indigenous groups that are on the continent now, even though most of the countries in Africa, these lines that establish the borders were designated externally. In Belgium in the 1800s, you know, someone said, oh, this is Ghana, this is Nigeria, this is this country. But these indigenous groups, these ethnic groups existed before the lines were drawn. And if those lines are ever rearranged, they'll exist. They are not going anywhere. Those are the countries, right? Vai is a country, Yoruba is a country, Fulani is a country, not necessarily the line. I think the lines that are drawn are secondary, and they always have been secondary. So Liberia itself, it's secondary. Nigeria itself, it's secondary. What takes precedent, what people honor and pay homage to are these groups. And so Gbessa's immortality is in conversation with that. June Day's strength and resilience pays homage to just the natural story of resilience of African Americans in this country. I recognize that as a Black immigrant, I have privileges that were earned by individuals who fought for hundreds and hundreds of years, and then an additional 100 years to ensure that I had some semblance of freedom. And that strength that June Day has is a direct result of that meditation. And then Norman Arrogan, I mean, we spoke about it before. I definitely wanted to feature the Maroons as part of the British exploration of what was happening around that time. They credited some of the success of the Maroons to witchcraft. They said, oh, it's actually, some of it is obey, they do black magic. You know, there were accounts of people disappearing. And so, of course, that's one part of it, but it's also, it serves a dual purpose because him being biracial, also feeling a sense of invisibility. And Charlotte has that too on the plantation. June's mother of being a Black woman, that level of invisibility and having to grapple with invisibility and not really feeling seen. And in the same way, the biracial identity or having biracial identity and not always feeling seen. And so the story of Liberia is a story of how do I navigate, or how do I understand the various faces of Blackness. That's definitely something that I wanted to uncover and dissect in this work.
And that's absolutely gorgeous. It's definitely something that I did pick up on in reading this book, and I just thought was such an interesting way of addressing, you know, all of these, as you speak on these issues of invisibility or of having to be resilient, things that aren't necessarily positive, but they come through these characters in these incredible ways, then helps them to further help other people. And I just thought that was a gorgeous way of thinking about struggle and history. Thank you so much, Wayétu, for taking the time to speak to me and to be a part of the book festival. Thank you for writing this book as well.
Of course. Well, thank you for reading. I so appreciate the support, and I'm honored to be a part of the Edinburgh Book Festival. Thank you for reading, and thanks for this conversation.
Thanks so much. And to all of you listening, you can donate to the platform to make sure that they're able to continue doing events like this. And you can also buy copies of She Would Be King from the website. You can do this on the event page that this event lives on. And also just wanted to say thank you to the Skinny who sponsored this event, and to the Book Festival for putting Wayétu and myself in conversation. Once again, thanks so much, Wayétu, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Take care.